Hey Sunspace Sun, I'm Daisy Viktoria. You know what today? Let's go back to Germany. This time we are taking a trip to 16th century or 1500s Germany. Specifically, we are going to set our time travel dials to the year 1530 and we are going to go to Saxony. Now, I love a good medieval and Renaissance German gown, in case you haven't noticed yet. And this time we are going to explore a style that is so iconic in the art of this period. If you've seen pretty much any type of fantasy dress, like fantasy movies, even Disney movies, there's gonna probably be influence from 16th century German dresses at some point in these types of sources. One of the styles that just kind of is so iconic to everything we think of as fantasy Renaissance clothing is what we see in the paintings of Lucas Cranach. Now, when we refer to Cranach, there are two. There's Lucas Cranach the Elder and the Younger. They are father and son, and they both were painters in Germany in the 16th century. When we're looking for the dress that I'm doing right now, we're going to primarily be finding images by Lucas Cranach the Elder, but if you are interested in exploring this era on your own, please note that there are two, so plenty of sources to look for. Now for this dress, I had a beautiful fabric that I got at a Canadian store when I was up there with some friends doing some fabric shopping, and I thought, you know what dress this would be perfect for? A Cranach gown. One of the ones with the high collar and really poofy sleeves. I just thought that that would be the most perfect use of this fabric, which brings together a few things that I've been wanting to do for a while. One of them being experiment a little bit more with this high collar German style. Now, there are a plethora of paintings by Cranach showing this gown style. So this is not just a one-off. This is many of these exist. There's plenty of references to look at, and that means we can see a lot of variation in it too. Not all of these dresses have a high collar, and in fact, I've done plenty of dresses that don't have a high collar before, but right now we're looking at the high collar version. So here are a few of these examples where you can see this type of a dress. As you can see here, they all have this sort of open front area, so you can see the lacing, and then you can see a breastfleck or some sort of a cloth or embellished piece that goes across the bust. Many of these dresses have trim of some sort lining the outside edge of the bodice. Now, sleeves can vary, and what I want to do here is go for the many poofs type of sleeves. And we see this throughout paintings in the 1520s to 30s. I'm going for looks something like these. So I'm going to have little bits of fabric, or in this case, I'm going to use trim on top of my fabric to make it extra embellished, because why not? And then I'm going to have poofy bits of sleeve in between each section. So if you've seen me do poofy sleeve sections before, where I only did a few, and maybe you liked it and wanted to see what it looks like if there's a lot more poofy sleeve sections, then my friend, you are in luck, because that is exactly what we are doing here today. Now, as for the skirts on these dresses, not nearly as many examples because so many of the paintings are from the waist up. But we do have an idea what they looked like from many paintings that do in fact feature the skirts. These skirts could feature a few rows of trim or contrasting fabric, and I have a lovely trim that I got at the same place I got the fabric that I will be using to create a couple of bands around the bottom of my skirt. And my number of bands was determined by how much trim I had. Very, very functional. Now, as we go through the making of this dress, I'm going to adjust my already existing bodice pattern to create this collared bodice. And then I'm going to adjust my existing sleeve pattern to create this sort of very poofy sleeve. And then my skirt is going to be rectangles that I am going to pleat onto the bodice. For headwear, you can see there's a couple of choices we have here. The big hats are always fun, but I decided this time I wanted to make use of my Flinderhaube, which is a very sparkly headpiece that I have worn with German outfits before, and I love any excuse to sparkle. In some of the Cranach portraits, the women are depicted wearing a haube or a hat, which is often gold. And these gold haubes can be embellished. They can have pearls or other things on them. They can also have sequins or spangles, which are, you guessed it, little sparkly metal bits. This particular gold haube or Flinderhaube with the spangles was created for some of my Swabian dresses. So it's not made specifically on one of the Lucas Cranach paintings, but it's in the same kind of style, so I think it'll work great just as is. The only difference to how I've worn it before is I'm going to add a band that goes with the Flinderhaube that corresponds to the trim I used on my dress, so I think that'll tie it all together. And then as for the jewelry, it's very common to have gold chains with these Cranach-style gowns. Another common thing is a collar. Now I used to make these collars with more like trim, or like maybe I would bead the trim, but over the past couple years I've been trying a different method where I'm using like a metal filigree piece and putting that on top of a velvet choker and then embellishing it from there with stones and pearls. This is really a not super difficult, sort of low barrier to entry way to make these collars. So yes, you can make a Cranach collar with all found bits and baubles, it turns out. To make this dress, I'm using a bodice pattern that I drafted myself. This is kind of a standard bodice pattern, but with a high collar added. I'm cutting the bodice of the dress out of 3 layers of fabric. So I have my fashion fabric. I also have a very thick canvas interlining, which is what you see here, and I'm setting that on top of the interlining to cut that out. And that is sort of a silky, I believe it's a rayon silk blend, and that's going to be the innermost layer of the bodice. So it'll be fashion fabric, canvas, interlining. Now when you sew together a lined bodice, you can do it a couple of ways. So you could sew the outer fabric and the lining fabric separately and then sew them together after, or you can just flat line everything so you can put all the pieces together and sew it just as though it is a very thick piece of fabric. And that is what I chose to do in this case. It's a little bit of a faster method, and it's also easier to adjust it later if you need to take it in or let it out for any reason. So that's kind of an added bonus. But for me, it was primarily the speed factor. And that's combined with the fact that it's very easy to get nice flat fabric panels when you do it this way, because you're sewing them all together straight away from the start. So they just kind of fit together really nicely, as long as you make sure that you like pin them together and work them flat and everything as you go. There is some trying on the pattern to do in between the sewing, because this was an adjustment I was making to my pattern, so I had to make sure that it looked okay. Here you can see how I've sewn the bodice pieces, so 2 fronts and 2 backs together, just flat lined as though it's one very thick piece of fabric that's made up of 3 fabrics sandwiched together. Let's go ahead and work on the skirt while we're at it. The skirt is an easy pattern because it's just rectangles. Love it. Love the easy rectangle skirts. So what we're doing here is taking a huge rectangle and it's going to be pleated really small into the waistband. Now I have this gorgeous trim that I'm using on my skirt, and I had just enough trim to do 2 bands, so that is what determined I will have 2 bands on my skirt. And I'm attaching this trim after I've already sewn my skirt together. Now another note on this skirt is that it is lined. I don't always line my skirts. This fabric is kind of thin. The lining fabric is also kind of thin, so put together they give it enough body that I'm happy with. I am also adding trim to the bodice. A lot of these gowns have trim around the neckline and the opening of the bodice, and I'm using this trim that really complements the other trim, but it's just a thinner, a kind of less elaborate, but still quite sparkly trim. And both of these trims have a lot of flat sequins, or what's called spangles, in period. And we see these all over period paintings. So I think this is a great opportunity to have a very bedazzled dress. I will be wearing this to a fancy formal event, so we are getting very spangled and sparkly. To finish off the edges of my bodice, I decided to do a binding, which I cut from silk. So this is a scrap of silk that I had already. It's gold and matches everything quite well. This is not a bias cut, this is a straight grain cut, but other than that, it's basically made the way one would make bias tape. So it's just a rectangle of silk and it's sewn on and then folded over and stitched down. Now to attach the skirt, if you've watched me do any videos with big dresses, you've seen me do this. I will divide the skirt into equal amounts. So I'll do half and then half that into fourths and then half that into eighths and so on. The difference here is that the opening of the bodice in front is not going to fully match and the skirt is going to match. So what I'm doing is I'm calculating how much I want to leave. So I want basically to make sure that I have the right amount for my opening. So I'm calculating how many pleats need to go across that opening. Now, if you're making this and you think this is a little too much, don't worry, you can totally futz with it. I just like to be exact sometimes when it's something that I really care about, but I have certainly done dresses like this where I just kind of eyeball it and it tends to work out in the end, especially when you drape it and check it anyway. So don't feel overly pressured to do this, but if you want to be exact, you can always measure that out. And I did that by measuring out my full waist and then measuring how big my bodice is. So there's a ratio, right? My entire waist to my bodice. So that ratio tells me how many of the pleats need to go onto the bodice versus how many go onto the opening. So just as an example, let's say that 3/4 of your waist was your bodice, then you would put 3/4 of the pleats on your dress and 1/4 would go onto that opening, or whatever the ratio ends up being. So once I have all of my pleats measured and marked out, I then match up the places on the skirt with the bodice where I have pinned, and I get those ready to sew together. Now, sometimes when I do this, I will do the pleats and pin them down already pleated and sew. Other times I will pleat at the sewing machine as I go. So it's kind of whatever I feel like and whatever the fabric kind of tells me it wants to do. Because, you know, every fabric has its own physics, right? There's some weave, there's some structure to it. So it's always best to listen. And it's always also best to do what feels comfortable for you. I mean, we do want to always push ourselves, right? Because that's how we get better. But you know yourself best. Like, push yourself in a way that feels like it's working, you know. So you want to challenge yourself in a way that feels right. And thank you for coming to my extra motivational talk, apparently. So here you can see how the pleats are going to look across the front. So we're just going to keep pleating across that section. And here's where you do kind of need to measure a little bit at least, because you want to make sure that the pleats are spanning the distance of your gap. The sleeves are a really interesting part of this dress. So I am starting out here with my regular sleeve pattern, but we are going to do a lot more with this. For the crazy sleeve I want to make, we need to do a whole lot of panes for all those like slashed bits. And in this case, I'm not slashing anything. I'm actually sewing strips of fabric that will create those panes. I've done a different version of these paned sleeves in a video several years ago, so you're welcome to watch that one if you want to see that version. This time we'll be doing a lot of panes all over the sleeve. Now the plan with the sleeves is to use this trim in between all of the slashy bits. So I'm playing with it and trying to figure out exactly what spacing I want for the trim. And then that's kind of my first step to the sleeve design. All right, so now we're gonna make some pattern mock-ups. We're taking the sleeve pattern and we are going to cut this thing apart. So essentially I need a bunch of really long strips, and then I also need the horizontal strips that are going to be where I put the trim, and that's going to hold all the long vertical strips together, which I think will make more sense as you see it come together. This did take a little bit of trial and error, and I did move these around a few times before I was finally quite pleased with where they were. And I would say that it's worth taking the time to get it all exactly how you want it, because there's going to be a lot of work that's going to go into this sleeve. Now, the long vertical pieces of the sleeve are longer than the sleeve itself, and how much longer kind of depends on how you want this to fit, like how much do you want it to poof. So I just looked at that. I kind of draped sections and played with it to see about how much I wanted to extend the sleeve, and then I just extended that sleeve pattern taller for those long vertical pieces. So putting the sleeve together, you can see it's cut into all of these horizontal pieces. These are becoming the bands that the trim will be sewn onto. So each of these bands is the sleeve and the sleeve lining turned right side out, and then trim is sewn on top of those. I feel like that goes so fast right here, but it actually took a really long time to do it. And what also took a long time to do was all of these parts. So this whole sleeve was quite an endeavor. So these long pieces are also an outer fabric and a lining. So I'm also sewing these all into tubes and then turning them right side out. Also, another very time-consuming task. And then all of those tubes are getting sewn onto the horizontal strips of fabric. And they are each essentially an equidistant measurement apart. The only exception is at the very top because there's a curve to the sleeve. So like some parts, I guess, are a different distance due to where they're at on the curve, right? So that is really the sleeves. They have to be sewn together into tubes, but only at the horizontal bits, right? Because the rest is just long vertical pieces. To attach the sleeves to the bodice, I first did more of that silk edging for the sleeve holes or the arm size, and then that gave me not only a nice defined feature, so I think it looks really nice having that piece of silk there for some contrast. Also, it gives me a nice place to attach the sleeves on there. Now you could of course attach these without that. You would just attach them straight onto the bodice, as I have done before in the other different version of paned sleeves. So this is really almost done with the gown. Finishing touches for the gown, I have lacing rings and a cord to lace up the bodice. And I like to put ties on the skirt so that I can tie it closed, and that gives me just a little bit of adjustability as well. For accessories, I have a belt that I made out of velvet and metal findings that I got from Armor and Castings. They are over in the Ukraine and make amazing metal bits. The panel that you see across the bodice is actually just pinned onto the bodice, and it's the same trim that I used in the skirt. I also really love the Cranach collar that I made. I've been making a couple of these out of velvet chokers and metal filigree findings and pearls, and I think it's quite lovely. And of course the haube we saw with a dress before, so if you want to see the making of that, you'll have to go to the video in which I made it. For now, we'll just enjoy it with the dress. The difference for the haube is that I did add a piece of trim to match the rest of this gown for this look. I quite like this look a lot. I feel so pretty and fancy, and as in terms of a fancy dress, I would say it's pretty comfortable. I've always loved this style. You see it a lot in all the fairy tales and fantasy movies and stories from our time, but it is really based on German Renaissance fashion. And I think this whole look together is really elegant, and I just love it quite a lot. What do you think of this look, and how would you envision a version of it for yourself? Let me know below. I am so happy with the way this dress turned out. This is one of my favorite styles of medieval and Renaissance clothing. This is one of the earlier styles that I played with a little bit when I had finally a chance to wear a lot of Renaissance clothing. And it's something that I've continued to play with over the years, both in period accurate and in totally fantasy variations. So no matter which way you're going, period appropriate or fantasy or anything in between, the Cranach-style gown is really a great place to get the whole gamut, and that's because we have used it as inspiration over the decades in so many fantasy depictions of princesses and queens and characters that we all know and love. Now, if you are inspired and you decide to make yourself a Cranach-inspired gown as well, please feel free to share it. I would love to see what you come up with. You can find me on all the social medias as Daisy Viktoria. My website is daisyviktoria.com. And a special thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. I hope you all have an absolutely magical day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye-bye!